Welcome to the Duckpin Podcast with your host, Brian Griffiths. And now, here's Brian.
My guest this week on this week's episode of the Duckpin Podcast is somebody that folks in the Baltimore, Washington area may be familiar with, but he has now moved on to new pastures and new opportunities in the Philadelphia area with WHYY Radio, the NPR station based out of Philadelphia. He is covering South Jersey for them. Please welcome Kenneth Burns. Kenny, great to have you on this week's show, man. It's been too long since we've done a show together.
I know. It's been, well, let's not date ourselves. It's just good to be here.
I was going to say, yeah, the first time I was on a podcast with you, it was your old podcast, and we were still using 2 zeros in the year and not one.
Those were the days.
Yeah, those were the days when people were like, what's a podcast? What are you talking about? I'm not even sure we called them podcasts back in the time.
The iPhone people did, but not so much us.
Yeah. I mean, we are older than we look, which is probably good for both of us. For folks who may not know your work and know your time either in the Philadelphia area or the Baltimore, Washington area, kind of walk through kind of your history with the radio industry. You've gotten to work at a lot of very big and prestigious stations over the years. So just kind of tell folks a little bit about your background with that.
I was literally a babe when I started, fresh out of high school. I wrote stuff on DCR TV, which is the website that covers radio and television in the DC and Baltimore market. I had some opinions. I shared them. Not much has changed from back in 1999 and now. But Jim Farley, who was running WTOP at that point, offered me an internship. And I was going to college locally. I said, I don't care about the credit. I just want the experience. Not that I could get credit anyway, because I was a freshman in college at Prince George's Community College. There's an interesting interplay in all of that. So keep the educational background in mind. From there, I went to WNAV. I was with them off and on for 9 years. Then I realized I needed to make money. So I wound up, well, before that, I've worked part-time for whatever they call traffic.com now. I was a road reporter, airborne reporter, producer, covering traffic in DC. Had a chance to do some fill-in stuff on Channel 9, the CBS affiliate in DC. But when I decided to get like a full-time job, because I was basically stringing along part-time income to, pay the bills, I wound up as a producer for Radio America, which is a conservative news talk network. And at the time, their biggest properties were Michael Reagan and G. Gordon Liddy. And it's interesting how we've gone from G. Gordon Liddy to Dana Lash. That's the show that they're syndicating now.
Yeah, it's quite a jump from one to the other there.
Right. And then I decided to, actually, the 2008 recession happened. And I wound up having my hours cut at Radio America. At that point, I was working part-time for WAVA, which is a religious broadcaster.
And for those who don't know, WAVA, that way back in the day, before my time, I will say before my time that I knew them, that was Don and Mike's home in Annapolis and in the greater Washington area, for those who know the Don and Mike show.
Yeah, the big-time top 40 station. Then Emmis decided to buy a baseball team and realized that running a baseball team required money. So they sold a lot of their top 40 properties. Wavell was one of them, and sold them to a company called Salem, who owns religious broadcasters and conservative broadcasters. They own a couple up here in the Philly market. And then after a couple of years after that, I went back to Radio America, but it was for a short amount of time. I wound up getting full-time at WNAV, stayed part-time with Radio America, and then at that point I was living in Baltimore. I decided to go for a part-time opportunity at WBAL as a weekend news anchor. Plus, I'm not going to lie, commuting from Baltimore to Arlington kind of got tired. And the sad part is it wasn't that bad of a commute. I mean, I remember commuting from Baltimore to WAVA, and I was working at night in those days. which meant I had to go through Baltimore rush hour traffic and then DC rush hour traffic in the afternoon.
Yeah, that's not optimal.
No.
Under any circumstance.
Guess which traffic I preferred.
I'm gonna guess Baltimore over Washington.
All day.
Yeah.
All day. So I worked at WBAL part-time for about a year, continued with WNAV as their afternoon anchor and covering the State House. And keep in mind, from about 2010 to when I left WNAV, I was covering the State House for them the entire time. I hosted Capitol Caucus. Didn't win any awards with that show. That's the other thing. Once you hit a certain age, 40, you realize that not all your stuff was all that good and you could have done better. So I landed at WYPR. They were looking for somebody to cover Baltimore City and Baltimore County. And I loved the beat itself. I got to be the big city reporter that I've dreamed of. I got to cover a major government. And then, of course, during my tenure, the whole Freddie Gray happened. So I covered the first riot. And this is where I have big problems with our colleagues in DC. I'm reporting on the ground in Baltimore. Basically, you have some unrest happening next to the convention center and near Camden Yards. Everyone seemed focused on the White House Correspondents' Center. I'm like, hello?
Yeah,
I look back at that.
I remember that. Yeah, I mean, it was pretty nuts that people were just not focusing on unrest in a major American city, 40 minutes up the road from where this goofy, I think that we can best call that goofy black tie dinner is going on. It's a very weird day.
Yeah, honestly, I want that thing to go into the lake of fire where it should stay, because one, we're journalists. We are not like celebrities. I mean, people may look at us as celebrities. In fact, I keep telling people all the time, I'm no stinking celebrity. I go in, I cover the story, I tell you about it, and then I go home and watch whatever it is on my television. Which I came up with the term professional extrovert. But of course, especially with bigger stations, you have to go out, talk to the community, meet with the community, and promote the product. That part I'm fine with. But when you start getting into the whole thing of walking the red carpet and then rubbing elbows with the people you're supposed to cover and hold accountable, you have to draw a line somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then your time at YPR, what probably the most famous incident that happened was with
We're infamous.
Either way, was with Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake, and you being unceremoniously put on the spot by her. She's certainly never been on my Christmas card list. So for those who haven't heard your side of the story, go ahead and tell it from your perspective.
Ironically, I used to be on her Christmas card list, and I have the actual Christmas card to prove it, 2014. But basically, I was doing a story on the Baltimore City Police Department being a state agency. And I had asked her, what if you have to change like a public local law? I mean, granted, the question was a little nuancy, but the bottom line is, if she needed to change something that her police department had to change, she would have to go to Annapolis. Now, for those not familiar with how Maryland operates, the General Assembly only meets between mid-January and mid-April, which is different from the situation that I live in now. New Jersey and Pennsylvania, for that matter, because I do some anchoring for WHYY, they meet year-round. Delaware is the only one in the region where they're also in the similar boat as Maryland, where they only meet part-time. And long story short, and you could find the YouTube video probably on my channel, she blew my question off. And afterwards, I pulled Anthony McCarthy, who was her spokesman at the time. I said, if I don't know what I'm talking about, I will say so. And then I reminded him of the times where she has been extra nice to me. And I'm gonna be fair to Stephanie. I'm not the only reporter that she has bumped heads with, but I guess she took a special liking to me, quote unquote, because I didn't just throw softballs. There were real questions that people wanted to answer, that people wanted to know and needed answered. And in this case, Baltimore was going to be under a consent decree, one way or the other. Even when, and this actually happened, the Obama Justice Department rushed to get that done before Trump came into office, because everybody knew once Trump came into office, off the table. Baltimore police would have been put in a similar position that they were even before Freddie Gray, when Mark Puente did that story about how much in settlements. I mean, it was a ridiculous amount, because they wanted to avoid arbitration. I mean, avoid a trial. So next thing you know, a couple of days later, Anthony calls my boss and asked if they could send another reporter. And my boss, for a moment, said, no, you don't have that option. You don't pick who gets to cover you. Then, like the night before the next open availability, I get the written notification that I still have on my hard drive to this day, that the open availability is at the mayor's discretion, and she has used her discretion to uninvite me, not welcome me, whatever term they use. Either way, I was done. Then my boss goes into my place. And keep in mind, this was when she dropped the bombshell. I was physically and verbally threatening to her and her staff. Keep in mind, there were no complaints to my boss. There were no complaints to the station. Well, that was until Tony Brandon decided to have his own meeting with Anthony McCarthy, and they decided to pull up some stuff between me and Adrian Barnes, who was the spokesperson for transportation at the time. Because I had my car ticketed again when I was legally parked next to City Hall. And the Kevin, forgot his name, but at least his first name's Kevin. I remember that one. He was supposed to take care of the tickets because, you know, I was parked legally, and the placard I had in my window, even though it was expired, Baltimore police said, it's still good. We're still trying to work that system out. And last I checked, they were still trying to work that system out. And that was 2014, 2015. I mean, admit, third ticket, I lost it. I was not happy, obviously. But I mean, who wouldn't be hopping mad? Adrian incited that even more. And I mean, I emailed the next day and apologized, because I normally don't lose my temper like that. But it wasn't like I was threatening to anybody. I just yelled and cussed. And apparently yelling and cussing doesn't work if nobody likes you.
Which explains why my invitation never arrived.
Yeah, but I never heard you scream. I know you may have said a 4-letter word or two every now and then, but at least those words you could broadcast on television.
Some television.
So then we had, so Tony Brandon went through this meeting, and you'll love this. We talk about this, and then a couple weeks prior, my boss wrote me up because I wasn't getting along with anybody in the office, because at that moment, WYPR, I pretty much viewed myself as the contrarian, and no one really liked that. There were things I disagreed with, and I was vocal about it. I mean, I'm a lot of things. Angry and not in control of my emotions is not one of them. And in fact, it was actually the web services director that lost it, but somehow I got in trouble. But he also happened to be one of the no votes when WYPR tried to unionize, and I was on the organizing committee for that committee. But I'll bore you with that yarn on a different day.
It's all wild stuff and things that it's funny. It almost wound up being a preview of kind of the of later years, what we've seen. It's both a preview of kind of the antagonistic relationship coming from an administration to the media in the Trump years, but it also kind of harkens back to the Ehrlich years with the Baltimore Sun, which just goes to tell everybody there's nothing new under the sun, no pun intended in this.
No, and it's funny that you mentioned Ehrlich, because when I was deciding whether or not to sue Stephanie or not, the Ehrlich decision in the Baltimore Sun affair, that was one factor. And then the other factor was I just wanted to do my job. And if I'm suing Stephanie Rawlings Blake or the city of Baltimore, and I'm the city reporter, I couldn't do my job.
Yeah, exactly.
And all I wanted to do at the end of the day was my job and inform the community and just try to move a path forward, especially since we had a consent decree coming down for the police department. You had a new administration coming in with Catherine Pugh and a lot of things. Also, keep a push pin in Trump as well. At this point, and I can't thank him enough, Paul Gessler, who was at Fox 45 at the time, and keep in mind, everything has been said about Sinclair Broadcast Group. Everything. From everybody. But I've always said that Fox 45 was one of the best damn newsrooms in Baltimore with very good photographers. And Paul Gessler put in the MPIA, or the information request, then asking Stephanie to prove her claims. And they did not respond within the legal amount of time. Paul went out there and asked, hey, what's going on with our request? In fact, he went to them twice. And I did a follow-up interview with Paul and just explained my story, because at that point, my employer, oh, you'll love this part, Tony Brandon wanted me to go into anger management because he wanted something on the wall to make sure that I knew how to control my anger. And keep in mind, he was just he couldn't fire me right away. He really wanted to fire me because I was a supporter of when they tried to unionize.
Right.
Which is funny, because I remember after we lost, I met him at the Starbucks in Ruxton. I'm saying, you won, and man, did you win. You brought in some contractor from Chicago that we didn't even know was working for the company. And he hired Jackson Lewis, and their billable rate is like $500 an hour. I'm like, look, I'm going to give you a chance. And I'm not going to hold any grudges. Well, apparently he held grudges. I didn't.
Yeah, because you can't fire you legally for the union thing, because that's a federal labor law violation. So I just had to build the case up against you otherwise.
Right. I'll tell you how I wound up getting fired in a moment. So did the anger management thing, wasn't thrilled about it. I have the book. I still have the book if I didn't give it away to Goodwill. And the funny part was they wanted me to finish the anger management, and they didn't count the fact that we had an election. I was going to visit my cousins in New Jersey for Thanksgiving. Oh, and then here's the part that they didn't even tell me. My raise was not going to be given to me until I completed anger management. That was not made clear. And keep in mind, my employee evaluations were stellar, except for maybe, 1 through line, whatever. But either way, I had the 2 evaluations that I got were good. So here's what got me fired. Long story short, Jack Young, who was city council president at that time, he tried to do, I can't remember what the issue was, but he tried to do a voice vote, yay or nay, and then someone called roll call. And then he tried to do an end round around council rules, which said, if anybody calls for a roll call, you have to do a roll call. I tweeted it. Lester Davis, who was the spokesman at the time, saw the tweet and he was upset. And we talked afterwards. I mean, he was pissed. But then he went for it. He said, I'm a horrible journalist. That's arguable, because I will tell you there are a bunch of people who are better than I am. I mean, there's one guy here on NBC 10 in Philadelphia, Aaron Baskerville. He's a stud. I mean, he's a very good TV reporter, for example. But then he said, I worked for a second-rate radio station because they took paid programming. And this is a little nuancy, and I know we'll probably get into the nuancy stuff about radio, and I don't know if they still do this. Hopefully, the new general manager has found a way to discontinue this. Some of the features during All Things Considered in Morning Edition on WYPR during my time there, which was 2013 to 2017, was paid programming. Basically, and the city paper Ed Erickson wrote a story about it, where you have the underwriters do a program, and then their spots their announcements get played in another day part. So basically, funders were providing programming for the station. And that's what Lester was referring to. Now, I will say this, Lester did apologize, and ironically, I wound up getting fired like the next day.
Well,
or something like that, because I was fired for violating the social media policy for recording the conversation between me and Lester and posting it online. And I did that over the objection of my boss, the news director, partly because at that point I thought I had no allies, no protection, no friends. Basically, I hated going into the office because I didn't know what I was going to be blamed for next.
Right. Well, it definitely seems like you got out of that at a good time, and then you wound up in Philadelphia with WHYY. What led you ultimately to wind up taking the job up there?
I got tired of driving Uber. And I had applied everywhere. I was actually interviewed to be the news director at the Pittsburgh NPR station, but they decided to go with another candidate. But let's see. I applied for jobs at State College at WPSU, New England Public Radio in Springfield, Massachusetts. And in fact, they tried to find a way to bring me in somehow, but New England Public Radio, now New England Public Media, operates under the auspices of University of Massachusetts Amherst. So there's some public regulation that guides the interviewing and hiring process. Milwaukee, Richmond, Cleveland, North Carolina, I was looking everywhere. And I had actually started the search before I wound up getting fired, because I saw the writing on the wall and that I was going to get pushed out soon. And I was trying to leave on my own accord and try to depart as friends, but obviously that didn't happen. Then I was on a virtual job fair. It was sponsored by Current, which covers public media. And WHYY was one of the people. And I wound up meeting with the vice president of news and civic dialogue, one of my bosses. And then I reached out to the news director at the time, seeing if I could do some freelance. At that point, I wanted to stop driving. Well, I started to drive Uber just to pay the bills. Unemployment was tapped out. But I just knew that I belonged on the air covering news or something. And Philadelphia was like the next big thing. Oh, DC, I tried getting a job in DC. Got an interview at one station, not the one you think, but that didn't go anywhere. So met with the vice president of News and Civic Dialogue, signed a freelance thing so I could contribute stories, started getting my knowledge on Philadelphia up so I could try to contribute. Then they had another opening fill-in midday news anchor, which meant when the midday anchor took off, I would be driving up 95 to anchor news for a day. At that point, it was like the spring of 2018. I wanted something. Went up for the interview, did a demo, live demo, gave me a couple of stories, wrote the newscast. Couple of weeks, might even have been 2 or 3 weeks later, I got an email. Here's the Sunday morning manual. We would like to set you up for training on Sunday mornings. I said, wait a minute, what happened to the midday stuff? Oh, we could train you on that easily because that's not new to you. But right now we need somebody on Sunday morning. I said, okay, I'll do it. So train on Sunday mornings, doing that shift. And for the record, I've been anchoring Sunday mornings. It'll be 3 years this May. And plus it worked, it benefited because my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, she lived in New Jersey, and I had cousins, I had a friend up there. So it was not going to be too horrible. And plus Philly has a lot of things that reminded me about Baltimore as far as the grit and the heart of the people. Granted, Philly sports fan is a little bit more passionate than Baltimore sports fan, but the heart is there.
Be an understatement. We have never assaulted Santa Claus that I am aware of.
I don't think Baltimore has either. So I wound up getting more and more fill-in anchor shifts during the week, to the point that I was spending half the week in Maryland and then the other half in Philly and New Jersey. And then some job openings started popping up. And I said, okay, great. This is my time to shine. Didn't get any of them. And I was told I needed to do some more recent reporting. Wasn't happy about it. They probably knew that. But I'm like, okay, fine. I will prove that I can hang. And I did. I turned in several stories. Did some more fill-in anchoring. And actually, one of those stories won an award last year. 10 years of a soccer team in Chester, the Philadelphia Union. Where are things now? And that's when I really started to appreciate Philly fan, going to a Philadelphia Union game and a soccer game at that. It's like European light. I mean, the atmosphere was lively, and it's loud throughout the entire game, but it got really loud when they scored. So then we get to COVID. Not anchoring as much, not reporting as much, but at some point, an opening was created for the South Jersey reporter, which was a full-time position. I wanted a full-time position, and I wanted to report it somewhere. And they offered me the job. So since July of last year, I've been covering South Jersey while anchoring, because, they still anchoring. There's at some point, I'm not going to anchor on Sunday mornings, which will make my wife happy. Well, she wants to go to church together.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, somebody's got to pull the shift, but
right.
Yeah, but I can commiserate with that.
but no, but overall it took a lot of prayer and a lot of patience to finally get to where I'm content.
That's good, and that's important. Having that sense of peace in your professional life is just as important as having that peace in your personal life. And you kind of got both going there with a job that you're enjoying and a new wife and everything else like that, which is good. Let's talk about the job for a second. And kind of talk about, because you mentioned that there's two different things that you're doing, and I have to imagine that your preparation for both of them is drastically different between anchoring a Sunday morning show and then being a South Jersey reporter. So kind of take us through that process. radio reporters, TV reporters, all sorts of reporters now are kind of more Swiss Army knives than they ever have been at any time in the past, as far as having to, take video and record and edit on the fly and stuff like that. So kind of walk folks through a little bit about what each of those days looks like, either as both as an anchor and as the South Jersey reporter.
And it's funny because radio news people have been Swiss Army knives for a long time. Television's just starting to get familiar with that, especially in your bigger markets. Baltimore, you might see the reporter also serve as their own photographer. Not so much in like New York and Philly. I mean, there's like a couple of instances like with News 12 and New York, or Spectrum News, New York 1 in New York. But as a reporter, I'm constantly reading everything New Jersey, not just newspapers, but whatever video clips I get. I'm blessed in living in Mercer County, and that the Verizon cable lineup includes all of the Philly TV stations and the major New York ones. And they both happen to be owned by the networks for the most part. So I'm watching those newscasts. NJTV, which is the statewide PBS network, they have a nightly newscast similar to what Maryland used to have until the 90s. And I'm checking there. I'm checking newspapers, and then you have the hyper locals. Remember Patch, Brian?
Yeah, they still kind of sort of exist, not nearly as the legitimate news source they were there for a while when we had, our friend Brian Sears was doing some work for them at one point.
Yeah.
And it's not quite the same, but yeah, I do remember them. I remember, you probably remember, do you remember Politicker MD? I know that was kind of based off of a New Jersey site, Politicker.
I was a columnist with them.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think
and then the 2008 recession happened.
Yeah, exactly. That brings back a lot of memories. So
yeah. So
it sounds like you got a lot of sources that you got, which is good.
Right. Well, up here they have a version of that called Tap Into. Only the difference between PAX and Tap Into is that Tap Into is more of a franchise, where PAX was more centrally owned. I think Verizon Media owns them. Don't hold me to that, but you had Tap Into, and I also freelanced for one of them before I got hired full time. I covered a township north of me, Raritan Township, and so I check those as well. I also get heads up from our editors about stuff that's happening. We have a State House reporter that we share with WBGO in Newark. Got to give them a shout out, because not only are they covering news, but they have some really good jazz music as well. So have to give them the shout out. So it's a lot of reading, and then it also translates into being an anchor, because not only do I have to know New Jersey, I have to keep up with some Pennsylvania stuff. And for that, I rely heavily. We have a Slack page for WHYY where we're constantly we're seeing everybody's story pictures. We're keeping up with what's being published, what needs to be edited, what happened in Harrisburg. And this is the other thing. Compared to now, Maryland is just like New Jersey, is a small state. So WYPR is the biggest NPR station in the state of Maryland. New Jersey doesn't really have that, which is unique. They used to have NJN public radio and public television. The TV stations the state still technically owns, but they're managed by WNET. The radio stations were split, the northern tier and the one in Trenton. And folks, Central Jersey exists. I don't care what you say or what you think. We exist, and I'm just saying that because my wife made sure that I knew that Central Jersey exists. So Trenton and the northern stations of NJM Public Radio were sold to WNYC. And they largely simulcast WNYC, except for the half hour that they simulcast NJTV News, or whatever they call the TV newscast these days. I think it's NJ Spotlight News now. The southern tier, ironically, was sold to WHYY. So our signal is fully repeated in Atlantic City, Cape May Courthouse, Berlin. Actually, I can do the legal ID off the top of my head. But basically, we have a lot of overlapping signals that cover South Jersey. So, and that's the other unique thing about my position. I take great care in covering New Jersey because outside of News 12, which is a regional cable network, and the newspapers at New Jersey 101.5, which is the commercial talker, New Jersey doesn't have any network affiliates to call its own. Channel 9 in New York, well, actually major television stations, because Channel 9 in New York is licensed to Secaucus.
Right.
That's an interesting loophole right there, but they largely program to New York.
Yeah, I remember. I'm old enough to remember watching
Mets baseball.
And the, oh God, what was that guy's name?
Richard Bay.
No, Morton Downey Jr.
Oh,
I remember watching that godforsaken show back when I was like 8 and 9 years old, thinking to myself, this is cool. And, it was stupid, of course, but, but I remember
you can't forget Howard Stern. He had his first foray into television was on Channel 9 in Secaucus.
I don't think I remember that. That
really?
Yeah.
Channel 9 in Secaucus. That was the flagship when he started doing television, was syndicated to everywhere.
Oh, that's fascinating. It's funny that if I remember correctly, WOR's building and some of their transmitter stuff is actually now used by MLB TV, if I recall correctly. And I know the NBA stuff is based out of there too. And I know the MLB framework for MLB.TV is running NHL TV. It's somehow tied into the WWE network. It's like, so there's still actually a lot of important international stuff coming out of Secaucus. It's just not, when people think,
well, if they were in the Channel 9 building, I assure you they moved somewhere else because they tore that building down.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe it's just a signal. But I knew they were tied in up there in that area.
They are. Secaucus is like a nice little media hub for no, actually, I think NBA TV was there at first. They're now based out of Turner in Atlanta.
Well, that makes more sense.
Yeah. But still, you still have some stuff in Secaucus that people don't really know about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Secaucus I've actually stayed at a hotel in Secaucus once or twice for some work stuff, and it's just kind of a weird little place, quite frankly. You're in the shadow of the Meadowlands, but you're really just kind of basically separated by them by the turnpike and train tracks and swamps, and it's just kind of a wild place.
But before I got sidetracked, I just wanted to say real quick, WHYY partners with a lot of stations around Pennsylvania, WITF in Harrisburg, WESA in Pittsburgh, WPSU in State College for state coverage. So, and a lot of the state coverage comes from a State House reporter that we share jointly. So
let's talk about that South Jersey part about, and I think people forget that New Jersey doesn't have quite that network coverage. Obviously you're lucky enough. You've got both the Philadelphia and the New York stations, which, as you know, from living down this way, if you have a cable system with both the Baltimore and the Washington stations, that means you get twice as much football some Sundays, which is very important. But since you're kind of, one of the only people in that point who has a major over-the-air media presence, are you wind up covering stuff that like the TV stations and the other radio stations aren't covering? I mean, are there some of these news stories that you're getting to that nobody else is able to cover just based on all of those other factors we just talked about?
Yes and no. Part of it is because I'm still learning the beat, but definitely in Baltimore, there's stuff that nobody else was covering that I would be the first one to. And then there's stuff that everybody's covering that I would be shoulder to shoulder with them. But there are a lot of stories in New Jersey, and a lot of them, some of them get air coverage, some of them don't, and that's just the nature of the beast. And if they do get coverage, it's mostly like either the websites or the newspapers, and remember, and NJTV sometimes, because remember, a third of the coverage, I mean, between the New York and Philly markets, New Jersey gets a third of the coverage out of each market. And there used to be an NBC affiliate that covered the Atlantic City market. But what happened was NBC wanted the entire Philadelphia territory, which Atlantic City was also part of. So that station wound up losing that affiliation. I think they're owned by Univision. They're broadcasting one of the digital networks, like Grid or Heroes and Icons. But for my purposes, I try to look for stuff. Like I sit down every week, look at what's been covered, and try to find the holes and what's missing and what's not being told. Similar to what I did in Baltimore, only it was every day, because Baltimore, in Baltimore, I was single. I was living and breathing my beat. I'm in New Jersey married, and I don't want to like forsake my marriage over my beat, because, there's, at the end of the day, like I said, professional extrovert. I'm at home and I'm enjoying my personal life. And that's something that I've really learned to value in the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's definitely something very, very important.
And then of course there's Twitter, and then there's the other thing. And then there's the other thing that I do. I DVR the newscast out of New York and Philadelphia just to make sure I don't miss anything. Because
all of them are just one in each city.
All of them.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, granted, the New York market focuses mostly on North Jersey, but we have part of the Central Jersey area, like Mercer counties in Central Jersey, Middlesex, at least the southern part of it. It's like this Central Jersey region that I happen to live in. It's like the borderline, and usually what happens in North Jersey usually affects South Jersey. At least that's what I'm finding. And then of course, we also have the news share with WBGO. So some stuff of interest in North Jersey might play in South Jersey, like if the governor makes a speech and announces a statewide program that will have an effect on, say, food banks in South Jersey, which is what I happened to have covered over the summer. They wound up finding money to help the food banks, which have been really, really zapped because of this pandemic, especially since New Jersey was one of the hardest hit states.
Right, of course. You mentioned something about the governor, and actually that kind of triggered another question in my head. This is going to be your first gubernatorial election coming up here in 21 since you've moved up to New Jersey. You've covered elections before, obviously. Mm-hmm. How much of your experience covering elections in other locations do you think translates to working in a new market like South Jersey?
I think it translates easily, especially if you just keep to the basics. Know your stuff, do your research, don't get caught flat-footed. Ask the question even if your knees are shaking. And I mean, but the main thing is to know who's running, know what they stand for, and then find the questions that aren't being asked. I'm actually looking forward to covering this election. It'll be interesting how we plan that out. And it's going to be interesting because Governor Phil Murphy is in a similar position that Governor Chris Christie was when he ran for re-election, in that he was managing a crisis, and he's managing a crisis fairly well. And Chris Christie, a lot of Republicans just wanted to excoriate him for saying good things about President Obama when he came to the state and offered help, accepted the help, and started helping get South Jersey back on its feet after Sandy. Now you have a pandemic that's almost a year old. Governor Murphy has been paying attention to the data closely. In fact, they just raised the capacity a little bit from 25 to 35% for indoor dining gyms and like ceremonies. And he lifted the curfew, the prohibition between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. for indoor dining. That was in place to kind of mitigate the second wave. And the numbers, they didn't really spike like you would have saw in other states like Georgia and Florida, or even I want to say Pennsylvania. No, not Pennsylvania, but the numbers have relatively, at least the transmission rate has stabilized. You saw the spike in cases, deaths from the virus. They went up, but we didn't see like the big numbers like 400 and 500 a day like we were seeing early on.
Well, and it helps his cause too, that the New Jersey Republican Party, of which I'm pretty familiar with, a lot of people up there, tends to have its own issues that will make it harder for them to field a credible candidate. But
now that's interesting because the chairman of the New Jersey GOP, Doug Steinhardt, threw his hat in the ring like before the end of last year, and he staked his claim on being 100% pro-Trump. And then the insurrection happened, and he withdrew. I mean, I want to say he withdrew while I was on vacation celebrating my birthday.
You'll appreciate this as I believe I probably will screw the quote up, but as they said in The Wire, the man can read a poll. One last question before we get you out of here, and this is kind of a broad topic that we could probably spend a whole hour on at some point. Obviously media is changing, and whether it's changing for the better or for the worse, I'll leave I'll leave others to comment on. But obviously radio is evolving, especially considering, podcasts, online media, satellite radio, that sort of thing. How do public radio stations continue to evolve? I mean, you have to assume in the future, fewer and fewer people will get live news coverage over the air, whether it's FM or, AM's dead almost, so we can't really say that too much. But, is the future of public radio the internet? Is it something else? Is it, kind of, where do you see the industry going? I mean, you've been doing this for a long time. You got a long time still to go. What do you see the next 10 and 20 years of the radio business starting to look like?
That's a good question. But there's some things that people need to do now so we could really get a clear picture. I don't think radio is dead. I don't even think AM radio is dead. The big deal is you have to fund quality. And public media, radio and television, we've been successful for a long time. And by the way, I'm not turning my nose up at commercial broadcasters because that's where I came from. And I have great respect for commercial media. But whether it's public media or commercial media, you have to think about quality and how much you want to pay for that quality. One thing about podcasts, and I'm not just talking about the podcasts of your shows like Dave Ramsey or This American Life. In fact, This American Life's a good example. The Serial podcast, when that first dropped in 2015, it was well written, well produced. The audio melded wonderfully because they took the time and the resources to do that. And radio at one point did that. And not that I have a political science degree, so I'm not going to turn my nose up at research, but some things are just over-researched. Some things you have to say, look, what can distinguish us from everybody else? And it's not going to be piping in a DJ from hundreds of miles away. I spent my birthday last month in upstate New York, and the main R&B station was on AM. Yeah, yeah, and it has been on AM for about a decade now. And I mean, they're simulcast on an HD channel. Luckily, I installed one in my truck, and they just added an FM repeater so you could at least get it over the air in Syracuse. But when I looked up the station, the two DJs that were like supposed to be the local DJs, they were piped in from Chicago.
Yeah.
For iHeart's station out there, V103 or V102.7. And I kept saying to myself, what happened? Because, and you know, between Baltimore and DC, we had our own V103.
Mm-hmm.
We had KISS or KYS. Don't want to get anybody sued. iHeart trademarked the moniker KISS.
Yes.
Okay, so KYS, WHYY, WPGC, which was a Churban starting out. That's like a combination between Top 40 and urban. Read black music. And by the way, not it wasn't just black people listening to WPGC. Let me tell you.
Oh no. No.
But they had great, strong local personalities. Albie D, who's doing stuff for Big 100 in DC, he's still strong to this day. But you have a lot of companies that'll pipe in these personalities from out of state. So they need to fix that. There needs to be more diversity on talk radio. If anything, I think the insurrection revealed that, because what happens when you have 12 hours a day of talk show hosts priming the pump saying the government's lying to you, the government's trying to steal the election.
And it's the same six guys too. I mean, that's, I think, the difference is the fact that, very rarely, I mean, obviously in Baltimore, we still do with BAL for the most part, where
Right.
they're running local, they're running local talk show people throughout the day, the quality of which is questionable, but we can talk about that off the air. But it's at least local, and it's at least not the same old stuff where, like where other stations, it's all Rush, or it's all Levin, or it's all Hannity. And at some point it's just an echo chamber. And, and you're not getting that, like you said, the diversity of voices, even if you assume that most talk radio is conservative, which seems to be the most profitable. I'm not going to say it's the only profitable.
Well, let's not progress the fact that it's profitable, but it was profitable for a reason, especially in the 90s, is because Rush Limbaugh in particular, he found a way to rile people up. Mm-hmm. And plus, he was an old DJ. So he knows how to be an entertaining personality. But when you get into the mode of creating an echo chamber, which some stations have done very well, and in fact, to the point that some stations, they switched from like ABC News or CBS News to carry Fox News. And then when they realized that Fox News Radio was an actual news product and they were going to report the news, they tried to find something else that fits with their ideology. Well, ideology doesn't keep you informed or serve the public purpose. I mean, I know people criticize NPR for having a leftward bent, but I listen to NPR a lot, and particularly the news magazines and the news coverage. Is it perfect? No, but will you get straight down the middle, questions being asked to both sides without fear or favor? Yeah. And again, I know I work in public radio, but I'm putting on my analyst hat, and I listen to everything. I mean, it's also part of my job, but I listen to everything. You're going to get that straight down the middle from NPR, and just like you will with CBS News Radio, ABC News Radio, and Fox News Radio. So, and then also remember, back in the 90s, you used to have liberal talk show hosts.
Yeah. Alan Prell here in Baltimore. It was the most one I remember the most. I know that
Victoria Jones on WMAL at one point, and then, by God, not all the talk shows were political.
Yeah,
they talked about issues, or they talked about weird stuff, and that's part of the reason why I think New Jersey 101.5 works. I mean, yeah, you have a strong Trump supporter in the morning, but during the day they talk about other stuff. They also talk about New Jersey issues, but they also talk about, hey, what was the best concert venue in New Jersey that you remember growing up?
Yeah,
stuff like that. And because of the success of Rush Limbaugh, which was great, I don't begrudge it, but we've gotten in this mode that that's the only way you can win on AM radio. And then there's the technical issues, and that needs to be fixed, because there's something to be said for regulation. And because right now, especially in our part of the country, the FM band is really crowded, especially between Philly and New York. DC, for a major market, has an unusually weak AM band. And in fact, I worked at WTOP when it was 1500 AM.
Right. And that was a clear channel station, not a small C clear channel station. No.
WTOP is not a clear channel station.
No,
it's 50,000 watts.
Okay.
Great during the day, but you'll be lucky if you could get in Fairfax County at night, because you have a 1500 in Detroit, and you have a 1500 in St. Paul, Minnesota. And that directional pattern is straight north and south, which means it'll boom in New York City, but not so much in Arlington, Virginia at times, which is why they had 107.7 in the first place.
Right. Now, of course, they've completely moved TOP off the AM band entirely, and 1500, that's WFED now, right?
Yeah, Federal News Radio, which is great. In fact, I was there when that launched. It wasn't even Federal News Radio. It was WTOP2, and they just covered the federal government.
Right.
And then it became Federal News Radio.
Yeah, it's something else. And of course, Baltimore and Washington are basically treated as one market almost to an extent as far as the radio signals go. Obviously, it's separate TV markets, but we still wind up with almost two of everything. But now we talked about consolidation and stuff like that. It's like now there's one hard rock station, because DC 101 has become an alt rock station. So you're seeing like, it's like the two markets are just like winnowing each other out, and there's only one of each, of some musical styles, at least. Obviously the talk and the news are kind of still a little separate, and you still got, the smaller stations like NAV trying to chug along, and, as far as having some news.
And it's interesting because they're really two separate radio markets, but they show up in each other's ratings, particularly in the bottom top 20.
Yeah.
Especially if you're an FM signal.
Yeah, because you can hear, 98 Rock, for example, you can hear that all the way past the southern end of the Capitol Beltway. You're basically almost. Oh,
you're in Virginia at that point.
Yeah, you're way in Virginia, and you can still get a pretty good signal on 98 Rock. So, well, you've been very generous with your time tonight. If folks want to reach out to you, want to know more information about your work, or want to get in contact with you, how can they do that?
I'm on Twitter and Instagram at PKB News. Paul Kenneth Burns News. I gave the government name away there. Instagram and Twitter there. I'm also, let's see, PKB Media. That's the easiest one. Otherwise, there's the main one for my portfolio, P. Kenneth Burns, which is basically my byline. Still anchoring Sunday mornings on WHYY, WHYY.org. Am I the best anchor? No, but I'm a lot better once I dust the mic off after a year or so.
Kenny Burns, thanks a lot for joining us tonight. We'll talk to you again soon.
Anytime.
This has been the Duckpin Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and download.